Have you ever, as a philosopher, I'm sure you've thought about this, like what connects your past self to your present self, that whole like memory and identity thing and what really like endures through time and all that. Today we're going deep on the deep dive into the ideas of Thomas Reid. He was really into those questions, those big fundamental ones.
Yeah, absolutely. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Reid on memory and personal identity.
Hmm.
It's a really great overview of his thought, and it lets us kind of get into how he challenged earlier philosophers. And we can appreciate, his own unique ideas.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to really unpack Reid's arguments, especially those criticisms he had of Locke and Hume. He had this interesting take on what memory tells us about who we are, and I think it'll be really interesting for a philosophical mind like yours to sort of follow along.
Totally. As we go through Reid's ideas, you'll see a few key themes pop up. First, there's this idea of direct realism when it comes to memory. Then there's his critique of the storehouse model of memory. And then, of course, there are his disagreements with Locke's memory theory of personal identity. And finally, his idea that personal identity is simple and unanalyzable, which is pretty wild. So let's start with that storehouse model. That's a good place to begin.
Yeah, the storehouse model of memory. Reid thought this idea went way back, like to the ancient philosophers. It's the idea that the mind is like a container, right? Storing all those past ideas or impressions. It seems kind of intuitive, like our minds are just like these big archives.
Exactly. The traditional view, the one that Reid sees in folks like Locke, is that it all starts with these physical impacts on the brain impressions. Those create like mental copies, sensations, ideas, whatever. Those become the things our minds work with directly, like internal representations of the outside world.
Reid wasn't buying it, though, was he? He had issues with this whole impression idea right from the start.
Oh, yeah. Reid was a big fan of good philosophical method. He loved Newton's rules of reasoning and all that. So he was like, hey, there's no proof these impressions on the brain actually exist. They're just theoretical. And even if they did exist, just showing that they're related to our memories doesn't mean they cause them. Correlation isn't causation, which Reid was very aware of, especially having read Hume's work on causality.
Right, that's like philosophy 101. So what else did Reid have against this storehouse idea?
His second point was, it's kind of a big one. He said, if these impressions stick around after the experience, and if they cause perception, then why do we remember stuff instead of just continually perceiving it? If it's all the same mechanism, how do we go from experiencing something now to remembering it later? The storehouse model doesn't really explain that.
That's a really good point. It kind of shows that the storehouse model is missing something pretty important. Now, the CEPP entry mentions that even Locke admitted that the storehouse was just a metaphor. But Reid still wasn't happy with how Locke used it right.
Right. Locke said that these ideas, quote, are nothing but actual perceptions in the mind, which cease to be anything when there is no perception of them, end quote. So he wasn't taking the storage literally. But when Locke talks about the mind like reviving these perceptions and painting them anew, Reid's like, hold on a second. Reid argued that painting anew already means you're using memory. How can your mind use an old idea as a model unless it remembers it? It's circular reasoning.
That's pretty clever. So even when Locke tried to get away from a literal storehouse, he was still stuck in that way of thinking. What about when Locke tried to explain memory without the metaphor? The one with present perception and belief?
Yeah, Locke said memory is a present perception plus the belief that you've had a similar perception in the past. But Reid uses that same circularity argument there too. How can we judge if a present perception is similar to a past one without remembering the past one? To compare them, you'd already have to be using memory.
It seems like Reid's really hitting on this key point that memory has to be more basic than just these mental contents coming back or being compared. Hume had his own take on memory too, right? He said it was like a less vivid idea popping up again from a past impression. What did Reid think of that?
Oh, Reid was just as critical of Hume's view. First off, he points out that Hume, like Locke, thought ideas didn't really last over time. So Hume can't really say that the exact same idea comes back in memory. It has to be a new one, just similar. And then we run into that circularity problem again. How do we tell how similar they are or how strong or vivid they are without using memory?
So just judging those things already needs the memory they're trying to define.
Yeah, exactly. But Reid had even more criticisms for Hume. One was about this idea, maybe Reid misunderstood it a bit, that Hume thought we could choose to repeat ideas. Reid argued that if impressions cause ideas, then choosing to have an idea would mean skipping that whole cause and effect thing.
That makes sense. If impressions are supposed to start the whole process, then Just willing an idea to come back wouldn't fit. What was Reid's bigger issue with Hume's idea?
His more important point was that force and vivacity aren't enough to tell the difference between perceiving, remembering, and imagining. Reid gives some good examples. Think about hearing a really quiet whisper. It might be less forceful or vivacious than a strong memory of, I don't know, winning a big debate. Or a daydream could feel way more real than a fuzzy memory. So how strong or vivid something feels doesn't line up perfectly with what kind of mental process it is.
Yeah, what we experience in our minds isn't always so clear cut. Reid also had one last big point about Hume that present ideas can't tell us they're about something from the past.
Right. Reid asks this great question, and I'm going to quote him here. What mark does it bear of the date of its archetype? He's basically saying that even if we have an idea right now, no matter how intense it is, nothing about that idea itself tells us it's from the past. Present ideas always feel present. They don't come with a timestamp, right? So you can't explain memory just by looking at how ideas are now. You need something else to explain how we understand them as being about something that happened before.
So Reid really took apart that theory of ideas and how Locke and Hume used it from memory. Then he comes up with his own idea, a direct realist theory of memory. For philosophers out there, what's the main idea behind this?
The big difference is that Reid says memory isn't about mental representations and ideas or impressions. He says it's about past events, events that the person was part of or saw. When we remember, we're not just remembering a mental thing, we're directly connecting with the past event itself.
Whoa, that's a huge shift from the other views. It makes sense though, doesn't it? Like when we remember doing stuff or seeing stuff, not just having a mental picture. It's a lot like the difference between episodic and semantic memory, right?
Exactly. Reid didn't use those terms, but he was definitely focused on episodic memory, those specific events we lived through, like remembering a great philosophical discussion you had last week. That's different from semantic memory, which is about facts and general knowledge, like knowing the definition of a priori, for example. The Ceph entry also talks about the previous awareness condition, the idea that you can only have an episodic memory of something you were actually aware of before, whether you were doing it or watching it. Reid totally agrees with this.
So for Reid, to truly remember something, you had to be there.
Yep. He says, things remembered must be things formerly perceived or known. You can't get to know something for the first time through memory. Memory is always about reconnecting with something you knew before, something you perceived. So for Reid, memory isn't reliving something from the past. It's more like preserving that first connection with the event, that direct experience of it.
And what about semantic memories? Reid says those aren't really proper memories in the same way as episodic memories.
Exactly. He thinks of semantic memories as beliefs or knowledge, not real memories, because they don't necessarily hold on to that past experience in the same direct way. Like, if you know a historical fact, you didn't have to be there when it happened.
So then what is a memory for Reid? Like, what are the parts of it?
He calls it a conception belief structure. A memory has two parts, a picture of a past event and a belief about that event. Importantly, the belief is that it happened to you, that you were the one in the memory. This fits with his whole idea of how perception and consciousness work. The picture is the content of the memory, what happened, and the belief ties it to the past and to you specifically. And, importantly, the thing you remember is the actual event, not the act of experiencing it in the past.
This brings up something interesting that the Sapi entry talks about. Reid says we remember events we perceived in the past, but he also says perception only happens in the present. That seems tricky. How can we remember events that take time if we can only perceive right now?
Yeah, that's a bit of a tension in Reid's philosophy. If perception is only about what's happening right now, how do we perceive things that happen over time and then remember them?
Yeah.
It's a tough question that Reid doesn't fully answer.
Uh.
But his idea that memory actively holds on to a past experience helps bridge that gap, even if he's not totally clear on how we perceive those events that unfold over time in the first place.
Okay, so memory preserves this past experience through a picture of it and a belief about it. And Reid says this happens right away, without us having to reason or figure things out.
Exactly. For Reid, memory is a basic mental ability. It follows what he calls first principles of contingent truths. For memory, this principle is, those things did really happen, which I distinctly remember. He says that in real episodic memory, we don't have to deduce that something happened. The memory itself tells us that. If we needed to reason about it, it would be circular. We need some other memory to base our reasoning on. Plus, The belief that something happened to you is already part of the memory.
And that's how we can still have memories even if we now believe something different.
Right. That belief is like built into the memory. So even if you later decide that your memory is wrong, the memory itself can still be there because the belief that it happened to you is part of it. It's not like a recording. It's more like an active representation that includes this belief about what happened, a belief that's about the past.
So, this whole theory of memory that Reid has sets the stage for his big disagreement with Locke about personal identity and the memory theory. What was the connection between memory and identity that most philosophers seem to agree on?
They all seem to agree that if you remember winning a big philosophy debate, then the person who won was you. It makes sense, right? Episodic memory means that you existed back then when the event happened. So people generally accept memory as pretty good evidence for someone's past.
But Reid thought Locke took this idea way too far and turned it into something that didn't work.
Exactly. Reid thought Locke went from this sensible connection to a full-blown theory, the memory theory. This theory says that personal identity is memory. If you have the same episodic memories, you're the same person. And if you don't, you're not. It's what makes you, across time, being able to remember or potentially remember the things you did.
So if you can't remember something, then according to Locke, at least how Reid understood him, you're not the same person who did it.
That's the logical conclusion. And Reid had some really good arguments against this. One, although it's not his main argument against the memory theory, is about Locke saying the self isn't a real substance. Reid was adamant that the self is a simple, unanalyzable thing that exists apart from the material world. He basically said that Locke couldn't say there's no self, and also say that personal identity exists over time. For Reid, real identity is personal identity, and that needs something that stays the same even when things change.
So for Reid, there has to be some kind of stable self for identity to last over time. What was his best-known criticism of the memory theory?
It's the brave officer thought experiment. He asks us to imagine a brave officer who was flogged as a kid. Later on, he captures an enemy flag in battle. Then he becomes an old general. Now imagine that when he captures the flag, he remembers being flogged. And when he's old, he remembers capturing the flag. But here's the important part. As an old general, he's totally forgotten about being flogged.
Okay, I think I see where this is going.
By the memory theory, the officer who captured the flag is the same as the kid who got flogged, because he remembers it. And the general's the same as the officer because he remembers the flag thing. But because the general doesn't remember the flogging, the memory theory would also say that the general isn't the same person as the kid. This messes up the whole idea of identity being consistent. If A is the same as B and B is the same as C, then A has to be the same as C. But the memory theory makes that breakdown.
That's a really good example. It shows how defining identity only by memory just doesn't work. What other problems did Reid see with Locke's theory?
He said that Locke was mixing up consciousness with memory. For Reid, consciousness is about what's happening in your mind now, while memory is about past stuff. If consciousness could do both, you wouldn't even need memory. He also said that memory isn't actually necessary for personal identity because we all forget things that happen to us. And it's not enough for identity either because just remembering something doesn't automatically make you the one who did it. Like Reid famously said, it is not my remembering any action of mine that makes me to be the person who did it. Memory is like evidence, but it's not the thing that makes identity real.
And Reid's last point against the memory theory was that it relies on things that don't actually last over time.
Right. They both agreed that memories, consciousness, and thoughts are all temporary and come and go. But identity needs to be continuous. So for Reid, basing identity on something like memory, which disappears, didn't make sense. He thought it gave us a choice. Either there's a real unchanging self that exists over time, or there's no such thing as personal identity at all. He saw this problem with any theory that tries to break the self down into mental bits that don't last, like Hume's idea of the self as a bundle of perceptions.
So if memory isn't what makes us the same person, and Reid believes in a self that stays the same, then what does make up personal identity for him?
Here's where Reid says something really interesting. He says that personal identity can't be explained by anything else. It's not that we don't know how, it's that it just is what it is. He says personal identity is simple and unanalyzable.
Simple and unanalyzable. That's a pretty big statement for a philosopher who's trying to understand everything. What does he mean by that?
He means that when we talk about something being the same thing over time, that's numerical identity, it's a basic idea. You can't break it down or define it using other ideas. It's different from being different or being similar, but you can't explain what it is exactly. It means existing without breaks and only starting once. Because our mental stuff is always changing, those things can't be numerically identical over time. So who we are as people can't be just our thoughts, actions, or feelings. Those are things that a self does. The self is something that exists apart from the material world, and it stays the same through all those changes. He even uses Leibniz's idea of a monad to show that the self can't be divided.
So for Reid, memory doesn't create our identity, but it's still super important for how we understand ourselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Memory isn't the foundation of identity, but it's direct first-person proof of it. Reid says that we know our own past differently than we know other people's past. We have this direct personal access through memory. Like he says, I know that I was present at my wedding because I remember being there. We don't have to think about it, it's just there in the memory. He calls this immunity to error through misidentification in real episodic memories. If it's a real memory of your experience, it can't be wrong about you being there. The memory just has that this happened to me feeling built in. So memories don't make us who we are, but they let us know directly and immediately that we've existed across time.
So to sum up Reid's ideas for our philosopher listeners, he came up with a strong theory of memory as direct realism. He had some great critiques of the theory of ideas and how Locke and Hume used it. He had this wild idea that personal identity is simple and can't be broken down. And he said memory isn't what identity is, but it's how we know our past directly.
It's exactly. Reid's work gives us a different way to think about the self compared to the popular empiricist views of his time. And he brings up really important questions about memory and the self that philosophers are still debating today. His idea that memory is direct and that personal identity is simple challenges a lot of current theories that try to reduce the self to other things.
That was a great deep dive into Thomas Reid's philosophy. Now here's something for you to think about, dear listener. If Reid's right and personal identity can't be broken down, if it's not made up of things like memories or experiences, then what is it? How does that change how you think about other big ideas like consciousness, free will, and how the self stays the same over time? Are there limits to how well we can ever understand ourselves at this basic level? Those are some deep questions to ponder.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're really into Reid's ideas, you should check out his essays on the intellectual powers of man. Or you can look into some of the other writings about him, like that S. Hep entry we talked about. That would be a great way to keep exploring these philosophical questions.